Good morning. Just waiting a few minutes as people come on in and join us this morning. Good morning. So happy that you're here. Good morning.
While we are ready to get started, if you guys don't mind, we'd love to know who's in our space today. So introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're joining from. In the chat, that's going to be the hot spot today.
All right. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We're going to start. Um, welcome, welcome, welcome to the 17th annual Kentucky Women's Festival, a day when Kentucky women writers, film writers, um, and the readers come together to discuss and share ideas. And we're coming together virtually again this year. My name is Dr. Jabani Bennett. Some people call me just Jabani. Some people call me Dr. Jabani. And I am the new director of the University of Louisville's Women's Center. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the diverse communities, including the folks on this call who were negatively impacted by the severe weather yesterday. So we're going to take a moment to honor the folks who are here. And I also want to honor the original natives of Kentucky, the First Peoples, who perished as a direct result of our nation's history of violence towards and dehumanizing of Native folks. We recognize the thousands of Native Americans who are still living in Kentucky today. So I invite you to take 3 seconds, a moment of silence to honor both the voices that were impacted and dealing with the weather and also our indigenous communities. All right, if you are joining us from Kentucky, put a heart emoji in the chat or reaction. And if you are joining us from somewhere else, put a thumbs up emoji in the chat or reaction. Yes, we are so happy to have you join us this year. Yes. As the new director, I started this past January, and we have been focusing on new goals and objectives that align with the strategic plan at the university, and also leaning deeply into an intersectional feminist and anti-racist framework. And you will be hearing more about our plans and events in the next coming weeks and months. I hope everyone have an amazing, a wonderful day at the festival. Welcome again. Bye. I apologize. We're going to go straight to the housekeeping rules. Thank you. So I was so excited, like, yay, we're all here. To ensure an engaging and smooth program for all, we ask that you keep your cameras off during the program. Your mic will be muted. Make sure you show some love for our speakers and volunteers throughout the program. We want you to actively engage with us, so please use the chat for any questions, comments, and reactions throughout. The program will be recorded and posted next week on the Women's Center's YouTube page. There will also be a Q&A at the end of each session where you will have the chance to ask questions by typing it in the chat. This will also include questions that were already submitted during registration. We will ask everyone to turn their cameras on for a group photo at the end. Please be patient with us as we make our way through. And today's festival is brought to you by the Women's Center with sponsorship with the Commission on the Status of Women, COSWA. I also want to thank the planning committee for working to make this year's festival happen. Our co-chairs is Phyllis Webb and Robin Harris, Jamaica Jones, Amy Purcell. I hope I'm saying the last name correctly. Letitia Reynolds and Patsy Russell. The Kentucky Women's Book Festival began in 2006. It was a dream of the late Corita Rita Jones, a Louisville author, playwright, and historian, who envisioned a Louisville Book Festival with Kentucky women writers as its focus. To make her dream become a reality in the early 2000s, Rita brought together colleagues and friends from her 12 years in U of L's Human Resources Department, along with authors from the writing group she founded in the early 1990s. The group was Women Who Write. The Women's Center embraces her dream and has been supporting the festival for these many, many years. Sadly, Rita Jones passed away in May of 2020, but her spirit and vision continue to inspire and motivate the festival's planners. At this time, former state representative Attica Scott, a community organizer activist, will introduce our keynote speaker for today. Ms. Scott wrote the foreword to the first author's book, Resistance in the Bluegrass.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Let me tell you about Farah Alexander. Um, I've had the honor of sitting down in conversation with Farah, having a good meal together. And what I will say is that Farah, for me, is unique. Farah is someone who is not interested in playing both sides to the middle and making sure that she comes out on the side that's on top. No, she plants her 2 feet solidly on the ground, and it's clear that she's on the side of justice, of liberation, and of freedom. And that includes Black liberation. That includes environmental justice. That includes LGBTQ rights. That includes the rights of immigrants and refugees. For me, as a homegrown, born and raised Kentuckian, I find that to be a rare jewel in our Commonwealth. And while, we may come from different backgrounds and experiences, Resistance in the Bluegrass is a reflection of Farah's willingness to sit down and ability, not only willingness, but ability to sit down with people and truly hear their stories and put their stories into a compilation that we can all take advantage of, consume, read, share in our classrooms, share with our families, share with our communities. And when you read Resistance in the Bluegrass, you'll see that it opens with this amazing quote from Anne Braden. This quote actually speaks to Farah. This is Farah in writing from Anne Braden. In every age, no matter how cruel the oppression carried on by those in power, there have been those who have struggled for a different world. I believe this is the genius of humankind, the things that makes us half divine, the fact that some human beings can envision a world that has never existed. It makes a difference to envision a world that is not built on patriarchy, to envision a world that is not built on the pathology of whiteness, but to envision a world where resistance is real and that we are standing up for who we are and what we believe in, and that we believe that everyone has the right to thrive. So not only am I honored, Farah, to introduce you today to the audience during Women's History Month, but I'm honored to introduce you today as young people are going to show up and show you what it means to resist against the police state and police violence. That is all coming together at the same time on this day. So I want to just read y'all very briefly a little bit of my forward to Resistance in the Bluegrass, because, Farah wasn't looking for someone who was going to make white women comfortable. Farah wasn't looking for someone who was going to make politicians comfortable. Farah was looking for someone who was going to speak the truth as a Kentuckian deeply rooted in our Commonwealth. Resistance in the Bluegrass is a complimentary book to Author Farah Alexander's Raising the Resistance, A Mother's Guide to Practical Activism. In Resistance in the Bluegrass, readers are taken on a journey through what has always been a part of what makes Kentucky home for many of us, resistance. Whether occupying the railroad tracks in Harlan, Kentucky, and chanting, "No pay, we stay," or occupying Injustice Square Park in downtown Louisville and chanting, "No justice, no peace." As you hear Farah today, I invite you to ask yourselves, how are you showing up? What does your community look like? And what are you building? Reading is a form of resistance. Thank you, Farah, for Resistance in the Bluegrass. Everyone, I introduce to you Author Farah Alexander.
Oh my goodness, what an introduction. Thank you so much, Attica. That means so much to me. And I mean, yes, Attica completely is the best example of speaking truth to power in Kentucky, and to have that kind of introduction just kind of leaves me speechless. So thank you so much. That is truly an honor. And thank you all so much for being here. I know that yesterday was a mess for a lot of people and has really disrupted a lot of things. And so I do appreciate you all being here. And also, I just want to mention that in addition to being an author, I'm also a student at the University of Louisville. I am a student at the law school, and I would just like to thank the university for all the support. I have been getting so much support from the dean to the professors and my fellow students regarding this presentation, and I just really want to thank everyone. I think that is incredibly kind and means a lot to me. So on the presentation, I kind of just wanted to go through my book a little bit and show some photos and share some things that weren't necessarily in the book, because this is a good opportunity to do that. So here you see the table of contents that gives you an idea of the topics that are covered in Resistance in the Bluegrass. And so I'm just going to kind of go through each chapter and highlight some stories, because that's something that I really like about this book. It was a real honor to speak to so many Kentuckians and share their stories, because there are so many Kentuckians who are, by all means, ordinary people that have done extraordinary things and made real change. So the first chapter is about poverty, and I opened with this quote from James Baldwin, which I really love and find to be incredibly true, that says, "Anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor." And one of the stories I was able to highlight was with Taylor Ryan, who is the executive director of Change Today, Change Tomorrow. And if you're not familiar with CTCT, they are a relatively young nonprofit that has done extraordinary work in the Louisville community on a mutual aid model, which basically means that there's not a lot of red tape. If someone says they are hungry, they will help feed them. And that is pretty much the end of the process. They don't have to fill out a great deal of forms. They don't have to meet a maximum income level. They just directly help people. And so one thing that I spoke to her about, and I'll just read a little excerpt. There are people who are living in poverty, but they are happy, said Ryan. And I'm not going to take that joy away from them by calling them poor. When I asked Ryan to elaborate, she laughed and said, "Say more about being poor and happy." Ryan approaches poverty as a systemic issue. It's statistics and numbers. But people are people. They're not just statistics and numbers, and they shouldn't be treated as if they are. When public assistance and charities serve the poor, there's often quite a bit of gatekeeping surrounding their needs and behavior. I'm sorry, I just got a message from Betty Grace. The sound keeps blurring out. Can you all hear me now? Can you hear me a little bit better? Please let me know. If not, I can switch to another mode. All right, I'm going to keep going and just let me know if there's a problem with the sound. There's often criticism of, still blurry? Oh no. Okay, let me turn off.
Can't hear you at the moment, Farah. There's no audio at all right now. Yeah. Still no audio. Uh-oh. Someone in the chat said if you unplugged anything, you may need to reselect your microphone in Teams. Sarah, can you hear us? It's just a moment, folks. Can you hear us, Farah? Try and unmute your mic now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but yeah, so sorry. Thank you for your patience. I'm go excerpt. There's quite a bit of gatekeeping surrounding their needs and behavior, and there's often criticism of what someone purchases at a grocery with an EBT card, formerly known as food stamps. People express the view that if a purchase is made with an EBT card, they want to see a cart full of healthy food and shelf stable items like beans, certainly not junk food like soda or chips, and certainly nothing lavish like steak. It seems only normal to have opinions about food that is not going home with you if there's public assistance involved. There are often conditions for receiving aid. When Governor Matt Bevin was running for office, he suggested random drug tests to be performed for recipients of public assistance. And the welfare queen myth tells us that those depending on public assistance to survive are, first of all, almost always Black women with many children and are somehow taking advantage of the benefits and living lives of luxury. This stereotype has persisted for decades, with many citing it as an example of the dangers of public assistance. But as the myth has persisted, it seems that an ideal welfare recipient has also emerged. With all of this policing of what is and isn't appropriate in terms of assistance, if assistance is needed, it must be temporary. The recipient must abstain from drugs, alcohol, and Cheetos. The recipient who is without a job must be actively looking for one. And joy is not in the equation. I have never heard someone in a nonprofit describe the people in need as joyous. I've never associated being poor with being happy. When we continue to gatekeep poverty and determine who is worthy and who is not while meeting only their most basic needs and nothing more, if there's anything I'd associate with poverty, it would be suffering. After all, when someone is enraged by the welfare queen stereotype, isn't it the joy of a poor Black woman they find most offensive? To call attention to the joy felt despite being poor seems like a truly radical statement, not only in the nonprofit world, but in our capitalist society. The world doesn't think poor people should be happy, said Ryan. When you see us on trips, know that we went several days without eating to make that money happen. Maybe we sacrifice a bill a couple of months, and even if you see us get the steak and shrimp in our baskets at Kroger, know that we're still swiping an EBT card. There are ways to be happy and still experience the aesthetics of this rich world. People are happy, and amid all this trauma, I picked at my boyfriend who works at the Parkland Boys and Girls Club, and there are shootings in Parkland almost every day. Not even a block away, I hear pop, 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 and kids are literally skipping. While seeing joy, you hear trauma. Even amid trauma, there is joy. Amid poverty, there is joy. You just have to find it, seek it, hold on to it, and you have to build community around it. Take control. There we go. And so in the environmental chapter, I spoke about Craig Williams, who was the Vietnam vet who worked to stand against the chemical weapons disposal that was essentially in the backyard that he decided to call home and raise his family. And he was very concerned about the safety of that, reasonably so. And he made great strides in environmental change in Kentucky and continues to do so. And this was one of my favorites. This is, and one of my favorite chapters was actually about religion. And I found it very interesting that I would speak to different activists, not necessarily about religion, but religion would come up very frequently because it was something that fueled their activism and their drive for change. For example, I spoke to Ben Carter, who is with the Kentucky Equal Justice Center, and he spoke about how, as a Christian, he feels compelled to make positive change, and that's something that really drives him. And speaking to many other people, it also came up. And so one person that I interviewed in the chapter about religion was Ira Grepper. Excuse me. And Ira Grepper is a activist who has been active since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And he is really incredible and also very, very funny. And so one part that I said was this guy wearing suspenders, thick glasses, and what appears to be orthopedic sneakers is a complete badass. And I am going to read a brief excerpt of that chapter with Ira. In his address prepared for the New Jewish Agenda conference in 1991, Grepper recalled the experience, which he described as a profoundly religious one. And just as a bit of background, the experience that he's speaking of is in the 1960s in Mississippi. Ira and many other activists with the Student Nonviolent Committee, which included John Lewis, were arrested for standing against racial discrimination. He said, "We arrived in prison trucks at the state fairgrounds where cattle had been kept and then moved, and which were the same buildings where we would be housed. Women and men were separated, and I didn't see my jailed sisters in the struggle until we were released on bond about 2 weeks later. After being booked, we had to pass through a cordon of Mississippi State Police. Some of us were beaten. In the Cavernous Hall, where we wound up, there were additional beatings for protesting the cops segregating us. Black civil rights protesters on one side, facing whites on the other. When dinner was to be served, the guards, as a form of control and humiliation, forced the whites to line up first. Each white inmate was given a slice of bologna stuck between two pieces of stale bread and a paper cup with milk, or rather tepid water with a little milk powder. Each white guy returned with his meal to the spot of the cement floor on the white side, sat down cross-legged, and placed the cup on the floor, sandwich on top of the cup in front of him. Then the brothers, the African American civil rights prisoners, lined up to get their sandwich and milk. They returned to their spots on the colored side, sat down cross-legged, placing their cups on the hard cement floor and sandwich on top. There was no talking, no one ate, no one drank. After the last Black prisoner took his seat, all of us prisoners, Black and white together and without prearrangement, picked up our sandwiches and broke bread as one." As he told the story, which he's told many, many times over the past few decades, he suddenly got choked up reminiscing. He quickly wiped away a few tears and said, "If I were a Catholic, I would have thought of the Holy Communion. It was that kind of solidarity that made such an impact. I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I still remember that thing." And on the chapter about education, I spoke of the many sick outs that you may remember several years ago when teachers in Kentucky, to defend their pensions that were in jeopardy, and protested at the state capitol. And they really helped drive Governor Beshear to office and stand against Governor Bevin, who was an absolute bully and said terrible things about the teachers. And they really made a tremendous impact and stood against his bullying. And so I shared one quote from Governor Beshear when he was inaugurated that said, "To our educators, this is your victory. Your courage to stand up and fight against all the bullying and name calling helped galvanize our entire state." And of course, in several different parts of the book, I quoted the incredible Attica Scott, because Attica has stood in the name of justice for so many different causes and is incredible. And one thing that I really wanted to highlight was a chapter about political representation. And Attica Scott, when she was in the Kentucky General Assembly, was incredibly unique because most of the Kentucky General Assembly are white, older, wealthy men. And I believe that has gotten even worse. And so I just highlighted one bit that I said, which was the crowd at Cracker Barrel on a Sunday afternoon looks more diverse than the Kentucky General Assembly. And I believe that is even more true today. And I was really taken by the stories of Anne and Carl Brayton. I think they just completely exemplified white allyship in the face of racial injustice. And one of the quotes that I liked from her, and this is one of her many mug shots, but one as she was older in Kentucky. And her quote says, "Either you find a way to oppose the evil, or the evil becomes a part of you, and you are a part of it, and it winds itself around your soul like the arms of an octopus. If I did not oppose it, I was responsible for its sins." I really loved that quote. Originally, when we published this book, we were going to incorporate photos, and this was one photo that we were going to include. And this is, some of you may have seen it before, but it's a really chilling photo. During the protest demanding justice for Breonna Taylor, there was a great deal of from the police and the National Guard. And this was one example of that. You can see these armored trucks. And then right above that, there is a photo of Alberta Jones, who was an incredible civil rights activist in Louisville. And it was just a bit ironic to see this celebration of Alberta Jones' legacy in Louisville, and essentially how the city is standing against resistance of police brutality and racial discrimination. I thought that was a very powerful and chilling photo. And in the chapter about LGBTQ rights, of course, I spoke about marriage equality and the Obergefell decision, because there are several Kentuckians who were involved in that, both plaintiffs and lawyers. And what was kind of amazing about that fight is that the plaintiffs that got involved just had the opportunity to take a stand for marriage equality. And these were not necessarily people who identified as activists. They are just completely ordinary people with families who wanted their basic constitutional rights recognized, to marry the person they love and have that marriage validly recognized. And so I shared a brief quote actually from the Obergefell decision, because I thought it was extraordinarily beautiful. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a law student. And so one thing I can share about being a law student is that we read many, many, many case decisions, and they are exceptionally boring and dry and not interesting in general. But this one bit of the Obergefell decision was just like poetic and beautiful. And I really loved that from Justice Kennedy. And the quote that really stuck with me said, "They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right." And I just really love that. And thank you, Betty Graves. I see as a law school graduate, you agree with that. And also in that same chapter, and this is very relevant this week, as the Kentucky General Assembly is actually standing against drag shows. I highlighted these stories of a local charity called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. They have a chapter in Louisville called the Derby City Sisters, and they are really, really, really extraordinary. And This is Sister Petty Davis, who I interviewed for the book. And in describing the group, I just said they wear habits, lots of accessories, full face makeup, and hold their flowing dresses as they move around the room angelically. They're mesmerizing. And so one thing that I want to highlight specifically about this group is that they are not just people in drag. They are a very, very active charity that makes direct change in the lives of Kentuckians. And actually, since 2014, they've raised $69,000 for local charities. And I think that is a good thing to highlight, as there is talk in the General Assembly about whether drag queens are appropriate for people under the age of 18. When I think about drag queens, I think of the Derby City Sisters, and I immediately associate the incredible change that they have made in this area. And for me, I think they are exceptional role models. I would be very happy to share those stories with my children. And I'd just like to leave you with that as we talk about that. And another story was about immigration. And here we have a student who was very active in the fight against ICE several years ago. And he actually graduated from the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law. And when he graduated, he held up a sign about dismantling ICE, which I thought was incredibly brave and powerful and bold. And one quote I shared about immigration and diversity in this area, I said, "For anyone challenging the idea that diversity is not our strength, I must remind you that not long ago, our taco options were limited to Tumbleweed or Taco Bell. And now you can get authentic Mexican food in Hazard between the flea market and Tractor Supply." And lastly, the last chapter is about feminism and women's rights. And so, of course, I referred to Kentucky's own bell hooks, or Gloria Watkins, who is absolutely incredible and has completely changed the state of feminism in the United States and introduced the idea of intersectional feminism. And when I wrote about bell hooks, it was before she had passed away. And I actually quoted an excerpt of her book with Wendell Berry about how they chose to return to Kentucky. And it was also a very deliberate decision because she knew that she would die here. And so one part of that excerpt says, "Choosing to return to the land and landscape of my childhood, the world of my Kentucky upbringing, I am comforted by the knowledge that I could die here." And in that excerpt, she spoke a little bit more about that and her home in Kentucky that I just found really beautiful. And I encourage you to read that if you get a chance. Thank you all so much for listening, and I absolutely invite your questions and hope to hear from you.
So join me in thanking Farrah for this amazing presentation about her
Thank
book.
you.
And we'll have a moment for Q&A. And we do have a question. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. But we have, are there common themes binding people who resist in Kentucky?
Mm-hmm. I think there are probably many common themes. As I said, just as an example earlier, one was religion, for example. So not everyone that I spoke with and not everyone who engages in some form of resistance is religious or associates with a particular religion, but many people are. And that was something that drove their activism. And I found honestly a bit surprising and fascinating. Another thing I think I would definitely associate with pretty much every person who resists in Kentucky was just the incredible gumption and bravery and courage that it takes to do that. You know, after writing this book, I have become fiercely defensive of the people in Kentucky. I think outside of Kentucky, too often people dismiss this area and they dismiss many red states. And I think that is incredibly unfair and also dismisses so many incredible people who fight against oppression. And I think for so many people who do resist, they know the state of affairs where they are. They know the state of the Kentucky General Assembly and they fight anyway. Like, for example, just this week in the Kentucky General Assembly, they are passing terrible bills, especially oppressing the transgender community and trans children. And even though the state of the General Assembly suggests that those bills will be passed, there was still a ton of people standing against it at the Capitol. And they know that too, but they're still fighting. And I think that is really incredible. And I definitely see that in many people who resist in Kentucky.
So while writing this book, and again, folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be able to take a few more. While writing this book, getting to meet with, some of these resistance leaders and hearing stories about them, were you able to discover anything about yourself through this process?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think so. I definitely felt challenged, which I enjoy. I think that many of the stories, I think it was very, very empowering because, as I said earlier, many of the people who made significant change and continue to make significant change are by all means ordinary people. And so I felt like it really showed what kind of power each of us have and also the responsibility that we all have to stand against bigotry and oppression. And so I found some of those stories personally challenging, and especially the stories with the Bradens, because I am a white woman and I consider myself a white ally standing against racial discrimination and police brutality. And it was really incredible to read and learn more about them and the sacrifices that they made for standing against discrimination.
So I know, it's a not so easy process of writing a book, but, are there things that you're like, oh, taking on the continuous theme of resistance, whether you plan on writing about other stuff or dream of writing about other forms of resistance in our state? What are some thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I feel like I have stumbled into this. I say that it was a very strange pipeline that I'm on. So I was a stay-at-home mother who I've always been a writer since I was like 7. I've always loved to write. And so when I was stay-at-home mom, I blogged a lot and I would talk about things like cloth diapers and different parenting topics and things like that. I was basically a mommy blogger. And definitely leading up to the 2016 election, I felt as a mother to stand up against bigotry and oppression and consider that in the way we raise our children. And so with that, I changed the things that I write about. I started writing more about political activism, civil rights, and then I also got more involved personally in activism. And in that, I eventually came to the conclusion that I thought that law was the most direct way to enact positive change. And so I became a law student. And so I feel like I'm in a very strange stay-at-home mom to writer to activist to law student pipeline. And so I'm very interested in resistance, and there's plenty of material. Any one of these chapters could have been a book on its own easily. And so there's plenty of material. I do believe that I'll write more in the future. I'm not sure exactly what about. I am interested in using my legal education to basically demystify the legal process and help empower citizens and help them understand their rights and the legal process. So that's something that I've considered, but I think I will write about resistance for a long time, probably.
There's definitely plenty to resist about, so I'm sure you will have
Yes.
plenty of information. So got a couple
Mhm.
more. How do you see your law degree helping with your writing in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I, as I just said, I do want to kind of demystify the legal process for other citizens so they feel empowered, they understand their rights, and also understand how the law affects them and how they can use the law to enact positive change. One reason that I wanted to pursue law is because I saw how the law was being used for good, essentially. So, for example, when Trump passed the Muslim ban, um, I saw lawyers just run to the airports and they were filing motions on their laptops on airport floors in the terminals. And they basically just became like first responders in an emergency situation. And I thought that was really incredible. And I wanted to be a part of that. And so I would like to utilize the law to make positive change and also share that with other people so they can do the same thing, whether they don't necessarily have to become lawyers themselves, but they can understand the law and how they can actually use the law to their advantage, because as many of us know, the law has also been used to oppress people. And so, yeah, I would really like to kind of demystify that process for other people.
And then the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which I agree they are a fantastic nonprofit as well. Are there
Yes.
any other organizations or efforts you would like to draw attention to for the audience?
Oh, goodness. Yes. There are so many. I do love the Derby City Sisters. I think they're incredible. And also, the Derby City Sisters, as a charity, one thing that they do is support other charities. So they support, for example, the House of Ruth, Volunteers of America, Planned Parenthood, many other charities in the area, which is really incredible. And so I think right now it's important to really support the organizations and nonprofits who are in the most need. And there are many right now in Kentucky. As I mentioned earlier, the Kentucky General Assembly is really attacking the LGBTQ community and especially the trans community. And that was actually something in the book that Dan Cannon spoke of and predicted. So we expected the trans community to be under attack. And I think it's important for all Kentuckians to know that they are under attack right now. And so I would encourage everyone to support those organizations such as the Fairness Campaign and let me think, the Louisville Youth Group, especially. That is an organization that helps LGBTQ youth. And I think they need a lot of help and attention right now. And also on that subject, I think that everyone has a lot of power, and I would encourage everyone to contact their legislators, speak up in their school districts, and stand for trans kids. I would really encourage that right now.
Final question. So what advice would you give to maybe an aspiring writer, but also kind of a two-parter to those who want to join the movement of being resistors as well?
Ooh, okay. Great question. I think number one, jump in and do it. For aspiring writers, I would absolutely encourage you to write, and accept that whenever this applies to activism and writing, if you are brand new to it, you may be bad at it. And so I encourage you to embrace that you're going to make mistakes, recognize that those mistakes, it's totally okay. There was definitely a great deal of mistakes and failures that I've experienced. And I just encourage you to keep going. It's okay. It's really just part of the process, especially with writing. With writing, everyone deals with a great deal of rejection. And that's just part of the process. So I would encourage you, it may be difficult at first, but try to just embrace that as part of the process. And just recognize that you can do it. Like I really encourage you, if you have any interest in writing, to give it a shot and have a good time with it. And as far as with activism, I also encourage you to do that. The one thing that I would say, I think a lot of times some people can be very good at like acute activism. So an emergency happens and they care a lot about it and they want to like fix the problem and they try to reinvent the wheel a little bit. And that's not necessary. So for pretty much any issue, there are organizations in Kentucky and people in Kentucky who have been working on this issue and prioritizing this issue for years, sometimes decades. And so if you care about something, which I think is fantastic, I encourage you to seek out those people and those organizations and support them instead of trying to build something new or doing something like that. And so that's what I would really encourage.
Well, thank you so much for, of course,
Thank
writing
you.
these books, providing, the information about it and sharing with all the attendees today. I know many people are probably getting ready to go buy those books now as we speaking.
Thank you.
But please, everyone, join me in thanking Farah today.
Thank you all so much. This was really wonderful, and I'm grateful to be here.
And so if you guys are wanting to purchase her book, which we will be sending out this information via email as well after the program, in the chat, you can find a link to purchase these books at Carmichael's Bookstore, which is Louisville's oldest independent bookstore here in Louisville, Kentucky. So again, thank you, Farah.
Thank you so much.
And before we segue to our next speaker, we do ask, especially if you're going to be hopping off and not staying for the other speakers, which again, we will email this out. Please complete our evaluation, and we will also put a link in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll get ready for our next speaker. And we have it's our pleasure to actually introduce the person who will be introducing our next speaker is the founding Women's Center Director and local activist, Judy Jennings. So we will hear from her to introduce our next speaker.
Hey, I'm here. Thanks you all. This is so wonderful to be at the 17th Kentucky Women's Book Festival. I do believe Bell Hooks was present at maybe one of the early ones with Rita Jones, and so carrying on that amazing tradition of women writers in Kentucky. So thanks everybody for organizing it, and thanks everyone that's here. And it is my special honor today to introduce my friend and sister historian, Emily Bingham, who's a nationally known writer, but also a good community member here in Louisville and serving on Filson Club, University of Kentucky Board, and just being a good person. I wasn't surprised to learn that Emily was drawn to writing as soon as she could learn to type, thanks to her father, and because she is a beautiful writer, and many historians are not beautiful writers. So this is a special aspect of her work. In her brave book on My Old Kentucky Home, Emily also proves the power of history, not just to grapple with the past, but to understand the present and change the future. The book calls for powerful personal reckonings by all of us of a song we, or at least I, have heard all my life. Through her writing, she undeniably shows us the devastating impact of the nostalgia of white supremacy in our state and in our nation. Yet, as Eleanor Roosevelt advises, and Emily quotes, if we study history realistically, reckoning can be an act of love. And I would like to add, it can also be an act of unity. My pleasure to introduce Emily Bingham.
Can you all hear me now?
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Judy. That Eleanor Roosevelt quote is one of my favorites. And part of it, at the end of it actually goes, if you study your history realistically, you'll love your country just as much. Because I think there's something we're really afraid of, right, about confronting some of the harder things about our past. And so, yeah, let's dive in. I also just want to thank, before I do that, the Women's Center at U of L and all the good folks at U of L who are doing so much to strengthen and educate this community. And then also mention that there are sensitive material in this presentation because the song that we're talking about contains racial slurs in its original form. And we'll be looking at that. I hope that you understand this is for educational purposes, of course, and I apologize for the awkwardness and perhaps pain that may bring up, but I do feel like it's important to look at. So I have taken control, and There is the next slide. Great. So this is what we're doing today. If I could see all of you, all of your faces live, I would ask for a show of hands. How many of you have cried or just sort of felt like crying when you've heard the song My Old Kentucky Home? I definitely have. I've cried many, many times, kind of all over the place to this song. One time I remember specifically as being particularly odd was in the hotel bar at in Albuquerque, New Mexico, surrounded by people who had no idea why I was getting so emotional. But I think there's a reason for why this song has, conjures tears for me and other people. And one of the, well, there are many reasons, but one of them has to do with it being passed down to us with love by people who we care about. In my case, I think specifically of my grandfather, Barry Bingham Sr. He was one of the most joyous people in my life as a child. He just brought fun to everything. He loved the song. He taught me how to bet on races at Churchill Downs. And when I think of My Old Kentucky Home, he is one of the positive associations that I had growing up. But sometime around the early 1990s, I looked up the original lyrics of My Old Kentucky Home. Having never really understood what this song was about, I just got curious, and it was immediately clear to me that My Old Kentucky Home is about a man being sold downriver from Kentucky to die in the cane fields of the Deep South. Well, this kind of thing happened. It happened a lot. If you were enslaved here in Kentucky in the 1850s when Stephen Foster wrote My Old Kentucky Home, you had about a 1 in 2 chance of losing a parent or a child to the trade in flesh. Can you picture this? Can you picture your child, your mother, or your father leaving you in this way? Nothing deserves our tears more than this reality in our history. But that wasn't what I or the people I knew were crying about. I'm sorry, there we go. This problem or puzzle led directly to this book. And I hope you will check it out. There are a lot of incredible stories and truths revealed that came through my research and interviews with many folks in this community and beyond that I won't begin to cover here. And in fact, this talk is really a very specific one that I created for the the U of L women's oh my gosh, for this group, because I wanted to speak directly to women in particular. So I wanted to figure out how a song unambiguously about slavery could be so celebrated, so enfolded in our culture over the parts of 3 centuries, the 1900s, or the 1800s, the 1900s, and our own century now. And I also wanted to know, why did nobody seem to know what My Old Kentucky Home was about? Or if they did know it, they seemed very comfortable never talking about it. Imani Perry, in her recent Pulitzer Prize-winning study, South to America, posits that perhaps it is so hard to talk about race in this country because of the just plethora of unmarked graves that we are stepping on and sometimes stumbling over. And in a way, I think My Old Kentucky Home is a sonic version of one of those unmarked graves. So what we're going to do today, we're going to start with the song itself for a few moments, and then we will look at what I like to call the lady problem. We will then cover kind of quickly through some examples of the way tears have shown up in the cultural response to My Old Kentucky Home, and then conclude with some thoughts about gender, race, and grief. So here we have the song itself. We're going to break this crying thing down a little bit. And I have a sound recording of it embedded here that I'm going to try to play. I'm just going to play the first bit of it, and I hope that while I'm playing it, again, I'm sorry for the racial slurs, but that you can read the rest of the song. So here we go. Let's try this.
Emily, let me re-upload it to include computer audio for it to play.
Okay. All right. I'm hearing it, but shall I try again?
I'm gonna take control back and then I'll re-upload it to include audio. So
oh, okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, now it should.
All right. All right. Here we go with a clip from the song. Okay, I hope I'm back with you now, and you guys survived that okay. One critic called My Old Kentucky Home tear compelling, and the melody is brilliant. That upward turn on weep really pulls you in, and yet I think it's crucial that we also look at the lyrics. They're potent, and in singing them, people over centuries have had them enter into their bodies, into their systems, into their breathing. And those lyrics put us in a place, and they tell us a story. And I think it's important to ask whose story that is. On the one hand, you have this omniscient narrator. I'm going all English professor here for a second. But this omniscient narrator who's setting a scene and talking about they hunt no more for the possum and the coon, or the head must bow and the back will have to bend, or the young folks roll. So all these descriptors are being just, given to us omnisciently. But then there are these times in the song where these possessive pronouns enter. You've got the my and the we. We will sing, my lady. The last line of each verse begins with or ends with my, all right, my old Kentucky home. So that brings the listener in directly. So I'm just gonna move on to the next. There we go. So surely I'm not the only one who, if told don't cry, goes ahead and cries it out, right? This permission to fully feel our feelings is in some important way a comfort. But when it comes to my old Kentucky home, I believe that white Americans were never meant to feel its subject fully. Our nation's contorted racial and gender systems have ensured this. Look at the chorus. Who is the weeping lady? During my research, I saw something really odd and quite disturbing to me about how my old Kentucky home worked in the culture. And it had to do with tears, and it had to do with who was weeping and who was doing the comforting. And despite all the logic of this song, right, about who, what is happening to this man, this Black man from Kentucky, this is what I found. This is a hand-painted plate from the 1940s that was sold in upscale New York City shops. And here you can see that the lady is white and the person doing the comforting, literally on their knees, is Black. This is not a Kentucky thing. This is a national matter. But I will say Kentucky is in pretty deep in the form of this song. But let's go back for a moment to Stephen Foster. And he really didn't have much to do with Kentucky. He did visit as a very young child, but he was born briefly. But he was born and spent most of his life in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had his first hit, you'll all know it, Oh, Susanna, in 1848. And 5 years later, he drops My Old Kentucky Home. Unfortunately, his life was not a very happy one, and by the time he dies during the Civil War in New York City, he is living in poverty, separated from his wife, and a source of great shame for his family. His greatest hits, though, including My Old Kentucky Home, were written for the Blackface Minstrel Show. This is something that Americans did not learn in history class, and I spend a lot of time on this in presentations and a good bit in the first chapter of the book, explaining this was the most popular form of entertainment in the nation for generations. Blackface shows were fixtures in large cities, like every single night Christie's Minstrels played for 1,500, 2,000 people. In New York City. And in smaller towns, they were regular touring appearances, right? This was not a Southern thing. This was an urban, Northern, Western, Midwestern, Atlantic, much more than in the South. And how did it work? Well, white men put on Black makeup and costumes. They played banjos and fiddles. They danced and sang what were supposedly authentic Black music and dances for white audiences, obviously for paying white audiences for entertainment. Impersonating Black women was a key part of the show. The image on your left shows a detail from that Christie's minstrel sheet music. With a man, cross-dressing as a Black female. And on the right, this is a really shocking image from the 1950s, a PTA fundraiser in Virginia, where you have ranged on a stage all manner of stereotyped Black females. And these stereotypes started in the minstrel show and in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and unfortunately have scarred our culture and ever since, and Black womanhood ever since. So the point is, in showing this, is that in the context of My Old Kentucky Home and the 1850s, the concept of a Black lady was literally a joke, something that was funny, something to be made fun of. Now, Stephen Foster's genius I believe, with My Old Kentucky Home was to market the genre of blackface to a respectable audience. These were the best customers for sheet music were white women who played piano and sang in parlors. And so what he did is he mashed together a minstrel sort of subject of a plantation story with features of a typical parlor ballad. This genteel music underscored whiteness, while the lyrics telegraphed blackness and gave a kind of, I guess, an edginess and a hipness to the song. In her book, Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, the critic Saidiya Hartman scrutinizes texts that produce what she terms facile intimacy. A reader or a viewer's emotional responses to these texts can actually displace the original subject or victim and his or her pain and put themselves at the center of the story. Historically, the lines of ladyhood, and it's so great that Anne Braden is appearing in the second presentation of the day, as well as the first. Thank you, Farah. Historically, the lines of ladyhood have been very carefully policed. And there's a moment in Anne Braden's memoir, The Wall Between, where this Louisville civil rights activist recalled as a child her mother snapping at her. And she said, the mother said, "You never call colored people ladies, Anne. You say colored women and white lady." When my mother was growing up in Washington, D.C., and spoke of the live-in help servant named Clara, who her family employed as ladylike, her father responded just as sharply. "Colored women are not ladies," he said. In the 1950s, Braden broke with her race to devote her long life to activism and equality. This got her banished from white ladyhood, as the society that she had grown up with, and she gladly left that behind. My mother did not do that, and the Black women who worked in my home 50 years ago addressed her as Mrs. Bingham and were in turn called Hattie, Iva, and Louise. We were polite, we were raised to be that way, but that's not the same as dignity. And I cannot today summon the surnames of those women because we never used them. The point is larger. For the bulk of white Americans before the 1970s, Black could not equal lady. All right, but back to the tears. There has been a whole lot of crying to My Old Kentucky Home. So here's a quick review. After the Civil War and until about the 1930s, Stephen Foster as a songwriter was largely forgotten, except by a few really, sort of music people. My Old Kentucky Home, on the other hand, was seen as an authentic old Negro song full of simple pathos. In the 1870s, the Italian soprano Adelina Patti gave a surprise rendition of the melody as an encore at Paris's Grand Opera House. The Americans in the crowd went wild, according to one report, with strong men weeping and women hysterically giving vent to emotions they did not try to control. Black performers made it onto the stage in the decades after the Civil War, but their performances were almost wholly controlled by white producers, stage managers, and theater owners. And those people demanded shows that showed happy plantation scenes and included heartfelt songs like My Old Kentucky Home, whose plaudits, as one producer put it, whose plaudits come in tears. In 1906, the Louisville Commercial Club used my old Kentucky home as a theme for a week-long homecoming event aimed at expatriate Kentuckians. Their return back from wherever they'd moved on to live would bring an economic boon of, visitorship and hotel stays and restaurant meals and so forth, and also a chance to plug Louisville and Kentucky as a place for investment. The Courier-Journal published a whole section for the event, and you can't see it, but blacked out down in those medallion below is it says "The sun shines bright" in the old Kentucky home. And it's quite striking that the old Kentucky home, which in Foster's plantation, minstrel song is a cabin for enslaved people, has now become a columned mansion with a very well-dressed occupants and a homecomer, somebody prosperous with his suitcase making their way back. Now, on Foster Day, during this homecoming week of celebrations, there was a big event in the downtown Armory. 20,000 people came, and they heard, as the sort of pinnacle of the event, 1,000 white girls dressed in white singing all the verses of My Old Kentucky Home. The crowd listened with, as the reporter said, heads bowed and eyes moist from the depth of the delicate sentiment, until, he said, the suggested solace of "Weep no more" came with the chorus, at which point many of them burst into sobs of what he called joyful grief. The Daughters of the Confederacy's Paris chapter put together a songbook in 1901 and included My Old Kentucky Home in it. And then we have them gathering in 1909, all the chapters from Kentucky for their annual meeting, at which My Old Kentucky Home moved the women to tears, according to the minutes. In his popular book about his home state, the humorist Irvin Cobb showed a family gathered around a Victrola for a lachrymose moment over My Old Kentucky Home. And of course, you see, even the dog can't help weeping at this song. By the 1920s, state business and political leaders had figured out that the world adored this song. And in 1923, to capitalize on this positive publicity, they opened a tourist attraction, the Old Kentucky Home. You may know about it. It's still there in Bardstown. In July of this year, 2023, it will turn exactly 100 years old. But it is still built on this complete myth that Stephen Foster wrote the song there. Next. Thomas Clark came to teach history at the University of Kentucky from Mississippi in the 1930s. Today, the Frankfurt History Center Kentucky History Center is named after him. And he was immediately puzzled by the way Kentuckians embraced a song whose lyrics seemed to decry the slave trade. When Clark asked if he was teaching all-white students, asked his all-white students of the 1930s and 40s whether My Old Kentucky Home told a story of gladness or sorrow, their answer was invariably gladness. Kentucky's great historian concluded that My Old Kentucky Home captured a dream of a happy past before the disruptions of war and Reconstruction. That certainly aligns well with this 1950s Kentucky tourism photo for promoting My Old Kentucky Home, showing a group of people posing on the lawn, this idea of a dream of a happy past. In 1950, a North Carolina newsman satirized My Old Kentucky Home's ability to provoke white tears. The former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, we've already heard a little about her, and known as a racial progressive, had expressed her sadness that that the South was suffered from so much poverty and so much inequality in its racial caste system. Debnam, a Southern white man, aimed to put Eleanor in her place by sarcastically suggesting that she shut up and weep no more. This book, which he published privately, sold 225,000 copies. You can see maybe the detail here, 1955 edition. He just kept reprinting it. Yes, we should be so lucky to sell such numbers of our books, or at least I should. By the 1950s, Black musicians, and even some white ones, and many broadcasters were eliminating racial slurs like the D word from recordings. In 1957, U.S. Rep. Frank Chelf took offense at this and filed resolutions to ensure that no substitutions were used in My Old Kentucky Home or songs like it. These songs, he, especially this one, he loved because it made the eyes get misty and brought a red hot lump, as he said, to the throat. Eventually, national TV and radio networks, under pressure from him, pledged not to tamper with My Old Kentucky Home. And he called this a victory for his state, the nation, and, as he said it, all the happy, friendly, carefree, God-fearing, industrious colored folks. In 1972, a reporter interviewed the chair of University of Louisville's psychology department about the Derby, and was told, people just go to the Derby and sing My Old Kentucky Home and cry. It's almost a religious thing. But that year, following decades of protests by civil rights groups, Churchill Downs buckled to pressure from national TV advertisers and silently dropped the D word from the lyrics that were played and sung or printed in the program at the Derby. Now, you got to wonder whether these women who were attending the Derby that year missed the song in its original form, or whether Eddie Sweat, the groom holding the winner, Riva Ridge, was sorry to see it go. But others were. Louisville Magazine complained that the change obscured what the author of this article called a double tragedy. Many a slave owner, the article explained, suffered his own pangs of anguish at the events that the song in its original form describes. I guess my point here is that a song about Black people as victims had almost never been a song about Black people as victims to the white people who sang, played, or heard it. Cleansing the lyrics brought its own irony. A past with slavery gave way, and nostalgic slavery, gave way to a present where the song's taproot in slavery and race was simply ghosted. The happy nostalgia went on. But shadows remained. In 2002, Kentucky poet Frank X. Walker reflected on the spectacle of senior night at UK, where My Old Kentucky Home plays a central part as seniors say goodbye. When the TV cuts to Wildcat players and fans with tears streaming down their faces, Walker wrote, I know it's not the song that's making me misty-eyed. And here, quickly, we'll see if this works, is a clip from one of those nights. Okay, so why so many tears? This brings me to my final section. Let's see. I can move on. Nope. There we go. How can this emotional catharsis be understood in the context of gender and race? For sure, I don't fully know. I have no way to read into the hearts of people over generations and centuries. But I'm going to just put out a few ideas, and I would really love your responses and any kind that you want to bring. I really would appreciate. So beginning with white sentiment. The minstrel shows where my old Kentucky home first spread officially encouraged sentimentality. The English writer William Makepeace Thackeray, who attended one such performance in New York City, described feeling what he called joyful grief. That rings true for what people seem to feel at the Kentucky Derby and so many public spaces. This representation, as the song was, of Black pain has occasioned white catharsis about whatever: homesickness, childhood memories, a lost past that featured slavery and racial oppression. James Baldwin excoriated the rich American tradition of substituting sentiment, shock, terror, horror, tears, for action. Read this way, my old Kentucky home pointed right at the pain of the slave trade and converted it into nostalgia. Meantime, you've got Black pain and grief, which has been suppressed throughout American history. In his 1787 treatise, Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson wrote of the enslaved. Their griefs, this is his quote, their griefs are transient. Those numberless afflictions are less felt with them and sooner forgotten. They were clearly less human than he was. Witness the medical experiments performed on Black Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm not going to go into them here, but we can talk later if you would like. And witness the recent studies about Black women and childbirth. Historically, the white majority discouraged and dismissed Black people from expressing pain or sorrow or grief. And one example of this is in an advice manual written by the singer Emma Azalea Hackley. She trained Marian Anderson as a young person. And Hackley warned her young readers, female readers, that even grieving expressions of grief in religious settings, like in church, were looked down upon by white people as unseemly. Black survival has required stoicism, and no wonder we now finally, thankfully, are hearing demands for a space for the full range of Black emotions and expressions. Which brings me to white women's tears. Now, there's been a lot written on this, and I'm not going to go into it that deeply, but just touching on, understanding that the patriarchy has encouraged crying and tearfulness from certain people, from delicate white ladies specifically. And I would suggest maybe that white women's tears help white men. How do they help? Maybe by making them feel needed, powerful, and centered. White women's tears have also and their distress has directly resulted in Black men's torture. Think of Birth of a Nation, and remember that D.W. Griffith was from just down the road in Crestwood, Kentucky, its director. Or think of Emmett Till, and we know now that his white accuser from all those years ago is living in Kentucky and has never faced justice herself. During the Jim Crow era, white women's purity became an excuse for a reunified nation to reestablish political, economic, and social control over the Black population. white women specifically were terrified into upholding an order that falsely privileged them. Now, as to the men, white men have been occupying the highest place in our culture, and like Thomas Jefferson, have historically gotten to decide who needs protection, whose pain matters. So what does it mean when white men cry? The sports writer Frank Deford declared in the 1970s, "Any good man will cloud up when they play My Old Kentucky Home," and I regularly see obituaries that cite the song's power to dampen the eyes of the recently deceased. Patriarchy throttles men's emotional range. Tears are discouraged. My Old Kentucky Home is a rare exception. Maybe it's just an opportunity to emote. And this may explain why Foster's chorus works so well. The attention shifts from the sadness of the subject, or just sadness itself, to comforting and protecting my lady, or being protected, if you are someone who might think of oneself as a lady. So Stephen Foster's 1853 melody has undammed rivers of tears from many people who never knew they were crying or singing about a song about slavery, about a human sold far away from his family to a violent end. It has provided a semi-religious tribal experience that in these public settings that harnesses race and gender to sentiment. Perhaps this is why white women and men and the institutions, I want to emphasize, that want those people's loyalty and their dollars cling so hard to My Old Kentucky Home. Why do you love it so much? The local civil rights movement veteran Marie Porter has asked me. Her father taught her from birth that it was not our song. We want our celebrations to invite all, to have space for all. Kentucky adopted My Old Kentucky Home as its anthem a century ago, but it never really belonged to the people Foster's lyrics pretended to represent. For them, it's not about whether My Old Kentucky Home is redeemable. It is about whether it is useful. Perhaps it can be. The America's Got Talent TV show finalist a cappella group Lincoln Bridge released this 2019 video showing different concepts of home. One is the West Louisville house of one of the members' grandmothers. Another is, as you can see here, the Old Kentucky Home, former supposedly plantation house in Bardstown, Kentucky. At the same time, Dorian Hairston, a high school teacher and former captain of the University of Kentucky baseball team, has asked, what would it mean to have a state song that reflected me as a person, not someone who was owned? I no longer weep for My Old Kentucky Home. There's no erasing it, though. This is music, right? And it's also our history. But we can learn and share that history and decide whether to pass it down with reverence and love or with humility and care. We can also stop monetizing it with souvenirs and t-shirts and throw pillows and necklaces and glasses and on and on and on into the piles of material culture that are branded with this song's name. And I would submit that in white-controlled public and celebratory settings, we do not have to rise to our feet for it or ask others to. We should let go. And that may require some gender work. Women letting go of a fantasy of being ladies, and men finding authentic avenues for emotional expression. Thank you so, so much.
Please join me in thanking Emily Bingham for this amazing presentation on, I agree as well that that song just needs to go away and die somewhere. So any questions for Emily, please put them in the chat. But I would like to ask, so for you personally, while doing the research, 'cause I know at the beginning you talked about, your own family history with the song, but what was the journey like for you personally up to this point?
Yeah, well, it was a really long one. And I mentioned, I think, in the beginning of the presentation that it was really the early 90s. I moved back to Louisville, or mid 90s. I moved back here. I started having children. So that's when I figured this out, that there was a problem. It still took me so long to even decide like how to deal with that. And I went through my own, like, for a while I thought that maybe I should sing it in its original form, like even to my children, so they would know it, right? And know what the truth was. And then we would talk about it and all of that. So that was, one, I didn't know whether to stand up for it or not. I didn't know whether to sit down. I didn't know who, I was just so weirded out that nobody talked about it. And really then I think, the part of the book that what I try to do in the book, because I do not want to shame anyone. Shame gets us absolutely nowhere. We just wallow in that as white people, and makes us run away from engaging with our whole community. So I wanted to include in the book, and I do this through the chapters here and there, instances where I or my family interacted with this song, or, emoted on this song, or had, some connection to it, that just to make clear, like, I lived this. I was, I'm steeped in it. And that still, doesn't mean that I can't think critically and step back from it as well, right? So I guess that's my journey. A lot of people were, as I was writing the book, they knew I was writing it. They would, say things to me like, "Oh, are you gonna shut it down? Are you gonna, take it away? And oh, do you have to?" And things like that. And I did have to say something about this. It really became just not an option. It bothered me, and I knew that there was something that this community in our state particularly, but America in general, needs to take the time, and I think people are wanting to take the time to understand how we got where we are, and the ways that by paying closer attention and being more accepting of our past, we can move forward with just a greater awareness and willingness to, live the community we claim to be.
So, me and Betty, we are definitely on same brave wave on this. So, tying back into the theme, even from Farah's, you writing this book is essentially a means of resistance with our state's, and I hate to even say the word beloved history, because there is, unfortunately, for some folks who just have a beloved sense with this song, even though there shouldn't be, just because it's caused harm for a lot of our Kentuckians. But you did mention you received criticism while writing this book, but since publishing the book and releasing it, were some of the folks that maybe gave you initial criticism that may have read the book, have any attitudes changed by presenting like, no, this is why there should be some resistance to this song?
Yeah, and yeah, thank you. I have had some responses like that, like quite a lot, and it's really heartening. And so I've had people who, for instance, have been performed in the Stephen Foster Story, a musical that has been playing for, I think it's like 75 years now, in Bardstown, Kentucky, during the summer season in an outdoor amphitheater there. This is a theatrical opportunity that runs, a whole summer long for people who are interested in musical theater. And so it's a really big part of their lives if they make it and get cast in it. But I've had people come to me who've played in it. Until not that long ago, they still had blackface scenes in the song. I mean, in the in the musical, those have gone, but this is just a problem. I mean, you know, this romanticization of Stephen Foster and not understanding the milieu in which he was producing his work has troubled them now, and they are coming to that. I've had people say they've sung this song to their children over the years and their babies, and they've stopped because they've learned the background. So I do think people are really learning. And I mean, for me, digging this deeply into this one cultural artifact that is so loaded with exploitation and, you know, in so many ways, is really just, I hope it can be a metaphor for the larger, you know, examination and openness and willingness to have a discussion around the systems and practices that I didn't see before, right? That many of us who are in this privileged position of not having darker skin just never have to see. But if we let ourselves see, you know, something that moves us and how that doesn't work for the community, then I think that's a real step.
So someone put, you know, where are more forums for discussions like this? And I know, you know, over the years, there's been conversations about stop playing the song, like, you know, the Derby and other things. But have you seen maybe more of an insurgence of spaces to have more discussions on this specific topic?
Well, I do think that the one thing that trips people up a little when these discussions do happen is having to have an answer of what the state song should be. That's actually a question I get a lot. Okay, so you don't think this is a great state song for all these, you know, all the research you've done has, you know, shown that to you. What do you want, right? And I think we need to let go of that too. Like, we don't have to just, you know, changing something isn't always just about pushing a button, right? If we're in this fight for the long term of making this a community, you know, that serves and respects all, that is not a push the button kind of thing. So the same with changing the song. However, I do think there are going to be more. Somebody is talking about a petition going out that would hopefully come out pretty soon that people could engage with and write down the reasons, you know, they feel this might deserve being retired. I also think the specific institutions where it is regularly publicly performed, the Churchill Downs, obviously, the state legislature, which has, you know, the authority to, and also where it is performed. Attica Scott will remember is performed in the state legislature every session at some point by somebody, and that is just to me crazy. And then finally, the schools that use these songs, whether it's your high school or your university, like the band, the U of L marching band, plays at Churchill Downs. The University of Kentucky marching band plays this at every football and basketball game. So, you know, even Louisville City, our soccer team plays this at their stadium. So I think there are ways to also engage directly with the organizations. But yes, talk to your music classes, your music teachers. That's a place too where I think this is an incredible opportunity for education.
So we slightly talked about this, and I even would open this question for the audience to provide input. But someone asked, is there a song you could imagine or dream about replacing this? Do you see one being potentially written, or do you think, no, this is a song that'd be great to replace this song?
I love hearing people's suggestions. I'll tell you, you know, we are not the only state that has gone through a problem with our state song. There's Maryland, My Maryland, which was dropped in 2020 or 2021. It was also that was used at the Preakness race, right? The third the second Triple Crown race after the Derby. It had some really troubled lyrics about Lincoln being a tyrant, and the Civil War being about to reduce the people of Maryland to slavery. So that was a process where they just took it away, and they're figuring it out now. In Florida, where another Stephen Foster song was the state song for many years, Old Folks at Home, also known as Swanee River, the decision was to add in a new song, something about where the sawgrass sways, or seagrass sways, alongside Old Folks at Home, so that there was like a choice, and basically the governors, and whenever there's some state occasion, they just use the new one, not the old one. So I think there are a lot of creative ways, and we have so many amazing artists. I mean, musical artists in our history and our present, that I would much rather leave that to somebody who's a specialist. But any suggestions coming up in the chat, I would love to hear them.
Put y'all suggestions in the chat if you can think of one. And when you mentioned like all the other states, there was a comment that brought up specifically when Cheryl Lee Ralph performed Lift Every Voice and Sing at the Super Bowl. There was a lot of negativity. So we can again see these themes of this holding on to these songs, or even providing a platform for songs that literally uplift voices, still happening. And so somebody asked, have you had any discussions with any Churchill Down leaders?
Yeah, well, in the research for the book, I worked with their communications director. Well, worked with, that is not the right word. I had a meeting with their communications director, and specifically was asking if they had any records that they could share around the use of the song, or discussions they've had about it, or that happened over the years, or just stuff that I could use to understand better the corporation's engagement with that song. And yeah, that didn't go very far. They said they didn't have any, and actually, even when I tried to publish an image of Matt Wynn, who was the president of the track at the time when they started to use My Old Kentucky Home, which wasn't until like 1931. People think this went back all the way to the 1870s when the Derby began, but no, this is actually really something that was added in during the Jim Crow era, when the song had its resurgence in Kentucky, or not really resurgence, when it really became important in Kentucky. And so they did not even permit me to use that image, which they had donated to the Kentucky Derby Museum. I had to find another image. So they are not pleased with this. They do have a new person on their leadership team who's in charge of diversity and equity. And I would really love to speak to that person about this, but I figure that person is in a very difficult place, because the company has, this is part of what they feel is their sort of secret recipe of success. Juleps, hats, horses, and My Old Kentucky Home. And I think it wouldn't be that hard for them to decide to let it go. There's so much, like we say, there's so many great songs from Kentucky that could be used here, but it's a corporate decision. On the other hand, that's a lot easier than getting the Kentucky legislature to come together around this, because those board members could just decide. And I also am aware that many board members, or at least some board members, until very recently, did not know this history at all. And they've been told a very false history that Frederick Douglass approved of this song and thought it was an anti-slavery song. And anyone who reads my book, I hope will come away comfortable that is not what Frederick Douglass meant. And if he knew that this song was being played to this nostalgic, super moment every year for, millions of people to watch on TV and 150,000 to watch live, he would be rolling over in his grave. There is no way he would think that this is like anti-slavery. Yeah.
It's insane to me. As many people echoed in the chat. So my final question is, what advice would you have for other aspiring writers? And again, I think resistance is definitely a theme because you were able to use, your background as a historian to find all this information. How can we be resistors as well?
Yeah. So to me, the most important thing as a white person, right, is to keep these conversations going within my social and family and whatever professional group, right? I think that silence is the worst. And when I am in a setting where My Old Kentucky Home is being played, for example, that's just one, I am not going to stand up. I am not going to, participate. And that can create a conversation too. And it doesn't have to be ugly, this is, nonviolent, right? But I think the biggest thing, and this is where I think groups like Showing Up for Racial Justice, which I appreciate so deeply, are doing such powerful work in making, breaking down that shame and embarrassment or defensiveness, because it's really not about you. It's about what we have inherited as a culture and a society that is the problem, and it's what we do going forward. So I think, just continuing to have these conversations with your children, with your friends, with your siblings, with your, partner, about how stuff hits you and what you would like to see different and the kind of community we want. This is the long haul, and I'm proud to be on that, I hope, with so many amazing people who are on this call and also involved at U of L and in our community and obviously way, way, way beyond.
Well, thank you so much. And for all those in the audience, please join me in thanking Emily Bingham.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Then we have our final presenter, but before we do, of course, I have to give a plug for Emily and her books. My Old Kentucky Home and other books that have been written by Emily can also be found at Carmichael's Bookstore, again, Louisville's oldest independent bookstore, and you can find the link for that in the chat. And again, if you are having to hop off, please complete the evaluation, and we'll be sending this information out as well. And then I'm going to get things set up for our final speaker. So who will be presenting our next speaker at this time will be Kathy Yoakum, Associate Director of the Sena Jeter Naslin Karen Mann Graduate School of Writing and Associate Editor of the Good River Review, Spalding University. So the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi. Thank you so much, Jamika. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Katie Yoakum. I am, as Jamika said, the author of Three Ways to Disappear, a novel, and the associate director of the Naslin Mann Graduate School of Writing at Spalding University. And that is how I'm fortunate enough to know Angela Jackson Brown. Let me adjust my camera here so you can see my whole head. I first met Angela in the fall of 2007 when she was a brand new student at Spalding's low residency MFA in writing program. So Angela was already a writer of great promise at that point, but she was also new. She was just beginning, really at the very, very outset of her career. But as her first mentor, Rachel Harper, later said, it was clear, and this is a quote, it was clear from the very beginning that Angela came to Spalding to create lasting works of fiction. And that is exactly what she's done. And she's built an amazing career out of it, as you will see in her official bio, which reads, Angela Jackson Brown is an award-winning writer, poet, and playwright who is an associate professor in the creative writing program at Indiana University in Bloomington. I am so proud of that fact. And also, she teaches in the graduate program at the Naslin Mann Graduate School of Writing at Spalding University. So she has come full circle from being a new student to now being on faculty. She's a graduate of Troy University, Auburn University, and the Naslin Mann Graduate School of Writing at Spalding University. She has published her short fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry in journals like the Louisville Review and the Appalachian Review. She's the author of Drinking from a Bitter Cup, House Repairs, When Stars Rain Down, and The Light Always Breaks. Her novels have received starred reviews from the Library Journal. That's a big deal. And glowing reviews from Alabama Public Library, BuzzFeed, many more publications. When Stars Rain Down was named a finalist for the 2021 David J. Langham Senior Prize in American Historical Fiction. It was longlisted for the Granum Foundation Award. It was shortlisted for the 2022 Indiana Authors Award. And later this year in October, she'll be releasing her next novel, Homeward. So Angela's doing everything, and I couldn't be prouder, and I couldn't be happier for you here today to hear from her. She's a writer that you will never forget. So please welcome Angela.
Thank you so much, Katie. I appreciate that introduction. Thank you to the University of Louisville, the Women's Center, and to the Kentucky Women's Book Festival, and also to Farah and Emily. I was so excited to hear your presentations. And even though we didn't plan this, I feel like all of our presentations sort of just speak to each other. I want to just jump right in and share a few thoughts about my writing and the way that I look at writing as a tool to use in activism, but also just to also share with you some of my writing. In my mind, one of the things, or several of the reasons why I write, obviously to explore the craft of writing itself, but also to celebrate the radicalness of writing and what it means to be a writer, and specifically the audacity of writers, particularly women writers, to recognize that we have the ability to shift paradigms and affect generations long after we take our last breath. I often tell my students that writing for me is spiritual. When I was a little girl, I used to tell my dad often that I could hear the voices of the ancestors. Now imagine that coming out of the mouth of like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, but he was never freaked out about it. He would always say, well, I hope they're telling you something that'll benefit you later in life. And of course, when I realized that what I wanted to be was a historical fiction writer primarily, I recognized that what those ghostly visits really were the ancestral stirrings of the souls who had already journeyed to the other side. And for some reason or another, they chose me to be one of the oracles for their stories. And I'm eternally grateful each time an ancestor visits me. As a historical fiction writer, the act of sitting down and writing is almost like a seance. I'm summoning the spirits of the people of the past to reveal to me their truths, no matter how painful those truths might be for me. I'm trying my best to come to their stories with an open mind and heart, and I'm dedicated to the process of revealing truths, first to myself, and then later on to my readers. My first efforts as a writer began as a radical attempt on my part to create the mother that I did not have. My adopted mother did not want to adopt me. That's a very long story, but throughout my life, she made that very clear to me. So as a result, I wrote stories about the birth mom that I did not know at the time. And I would imagine her in my stories as this queen in a faraway land whose little girl had been taken away from her. Or I imagined her as this warrior princess who was fighting to get back to me and save me from the clutches of this mother who did not love me. Or I imagined her, this magical sprite who had powers that were taken from her, but at some point they would be restored and she would come and save me. I wrote about her coming to rescue me. And in that, I learned the power of words and the power of the pen. I understood at an early age that the pen had the power to eradicate harms, to rewrite the past and the present and the future, but more importantly, to give a little girl like me the ability to imagine what a mother's love might look like. Throughout the years, I have written poetry to try and make sense of my past. I often say that for me, writing poetry is like therapy minus the copayment. I would say now that it's also a way for me to process things as they happen and sometimes as they happened. So I'll start by reading two poems called Dark Child and Mommy Issues, a poem of dismissal. Dark child, she says, stay out of the sun. The sun will make you black. Look at how pretty your cousins are. Their skin is fair. Their noses stand pert as yours lays flat. Their hair falls in gentle waves. Your hair coils like a striking snake. What went wrong? I never thought you'd be so black. Mother, I say, what's wrong with me? You're not white, but your soul is bleached of color. What's wrong with my sepia skin? My darkness gets blotted out by your light. What can I do to fix what God has made? I'm smart, Mother. I study hard and I learn big words, but you don't see me. No words seem to validate me, and you never see me. Why don't you see me? Can't you look at me just once? Dark child, she says, stay out of the sun. The sun will make you black. Look at how pretty your cousins are. Their skin is fair. Their noses stand pert as yours lays flat. Their hair falls in gentle waves. Your hair coils like a striking snake. What went wrong? I never thought you'd be so black. This next poem I wrote when my mother really became absent in the relationship with my father and with me. Daddy and I looked for you. Daddy looked for you in the face of red-lipped porcelain dolls. I hated you for not being those pasty-faced dolls. I ripped the ribbons they tied to my braids and I cursed them under my breath. Wishing it were you, I assassinated with my words. I tried to break those dolls like creatures, and most times I did. I stopped looking for you when I found Alice Walker. I wore my hair natural to defy you and to embrace her. I painted my room the color purple, and I retreated into the worlds that she created. I adopted myself away from you and made Alice Walker my mother. I wanted her to birth me in reverse. I wanted to put all of my broken pieces inside of Alice's womb, and one day, in no real hurry, I would have her push me back out again, whole and complete. Eventually, you came back, but you never returned. Daddy tried to love you back into existence. I tried to hate you into extinction because, see, I didn't need you anymore. Alice Walker was my mother, and you had been dismissed. I had read you away. Years later, I wrote you away. I inked you out of my head. I typed you into a world that I never had to visit. And like you, I didn't even say goodbye. As I mentioned, I've always referred to my poetry as my therapy minus the copay. However, I also write for the purpose of forcing myself and my readers to stare unflinchingly at life's truths, both the capital T truths and the lowercase t truths. For example, by writing about my relationship with my mother, I started making a lot of discoveries about her and about me. One was she was a broken woman, and sadly, she did not have the wherewithal to fix those broken pieces before cutting me into little pieces in the process. Another discovery I made was I was not the problem. That took a minute for me to get that realization, but I'm grateful that I had writing as a release in order to help me heal those broken pieces of that relationship. And it was a process. So again, it feels very much like Farah and Emily and I were on the same page in so many ways. And one is that we all three, I believe, quoted James Baldwin. And he's such a powerful thinker. Why wouldn't we? And this particular quote is significant to me. Baldwin says, "People who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction." As a writer who often writes about challenging topics related to abuse, racism, sexism, classism, to name a few, I realized early on, if I planned on writing about those topics, I had to do it unflinchingly. I do not have the luxury as a historical fiction writer to tiptoe around history. History can be liberating and inspiring, as we've heard today, in terms of us coming from various locations. I come from Alabama. Many of you come from Kentucky and other places. And there's absolutely no problem in us finding something to feel proud about where we're from and the people there. I tell my students, I don't ever want you to read my literature and feel as if I'm forcing you to make a choice between the realities of the past and the people in your photo album. But at the same time, I do expect you to challenge and really think about that very complicated past that we all share and find ways to move forward, but also bringing the past with us. So yes, I had to learn to unflinchingly look back at the past, look at its both traumatic and embarrassing parts, along with the liberating and inspiring parts. The history that I write about in my novels can trigger strong, raw emotions among my readers. I know this because I often receive emails from individuals, both praising what I've written and also questioning why I would continue to bring those topics back to the forefront when so many people want to, quote, move on. And so I do write close to the bone, and I do it unapologetically. Writing close to the bone to me means I'm writing about things that are as close to truth, capital T, as I can possibly make them. And I acknowledge from the onset that they're going to make me uncomfortable, and they're also going to make others uncomfortable. Now, the added bit of emotion that often comes along with it is that I often offend people. There's nothing I can do about that. History is what it is. We can choose to learn and grow from it, or we can stay in a place of being offensive about those who shed light on it. I was giving a reading a few days ago, and a young man stood very passionate, and he asked me, why did I only write about the terrible parts of history? His class had read the book that I'm going to read from in a few minutes, When Stars Rain Down. And he said he did not understand why I chose to dwell in the negativity of the past. Now, what I translated that to mean was, why did I insist on writing about the parts of history that makes white people uncomfortable? That's my interpretation of what he meant by that. I can't vouch 100% that that's the case, but that was the energy I was receiving. And so what I said back to him was this, is that we live in a world of dichotomies, and what makes the world work is something that Al Green sang about. He sang in a song called Love and Happiness. And one of the lines says that love is something that can make you do wrong and make you do right. And I don't think the kid understood, because he was like 18, so he probably didn't even know who Al Green was. But I just love the ability to talk about Al Green, so I brought him into the conversation. Some of the older people in the audience smiled and nodded their heads. But the point that I was trying to make is this: there is no dark without light. There is no good without evil. There is no love without hate. We could debate that, but I truly believe that to be the case. If I had not gone through the trauma of having a mother who did not love me, when I finally did find my birth mother and she took me into an embrace, there was something so sweet about that unadulterated love from the 19-year-old who was now an adult, who gave birth to me and gave me up, but received me back. And there was something that made that even sweeter after having gone through all of the things that I went through. So I was sad that the young man only saw the parts of my novel that he judged to be contentious and divisive, because that means he ignored the fact that my protagonist, Opal, fell in love. He ignored the fact that a Black woman and a white woman found a way to be friends, even though the white woman employed the Black woman as her housekeeper, that they found a way in that contentious South to form a relationship that wasn't perfect, but it was different from anything most folks in that community experienced. It means he ignored the fact that the Pruitt family in my story were intact and they were whole, and they loved each other fiercely and would fight for each other. It means he ignored the laughter. He ignored the belly laughs of between the cousins. He ignored the baseball game where my protagonist's boyfriend got to pitch a ball to Satchel Paige. He missed all of those monumental moments because all he saw was those moments that I'm going to share with you today, with the understanding and with the hope that you'll see more there than just the fact that I'm spotlighting a part of our history that we don't necessarily want to face. As a writer, I write with the intent to go into the deep. I love that Adele song about going into the deep, rolling in the deep. I think as a writer, that's a necessity. Everybody can stay on the surface level, but as writers, our job is to go into those places that the natural eye of regular people can't see. Otherwise, why are the ancestors giving you these stories if you're only going to give a surface level interpretation of what those stories mean? I delve into the houses covered with kudzu. As a little girl, I would sometimes go missing, and my dad would find me in one of the neighboring houses that used to belong to a relative, and it was covered up with kudzu. And he'd say, "Little girl, why are you going into that house? You're going to get bit by a snake." And I say, "Daddy, but it's quiet in here and it's cool. And I feel like I'm in a cocoon." I always love to share new words with Daddy. And so when I heard the word cocoon and I looked it up, I thought, that's exactly what it feels like to be inside this house. I'm protected. I didn't fear the snakes. I felt protected from everything that was out there. I write with the intent to exorcise the demons that no one else wants to face. So I'm going to share with you a bit of that. Because the other side of that is that as I take you into these difficult places, my other intent is to offer you a healing balm that will hopefully soothe you from the things that you have to face when reading my work. So I'm starting at a point in the novel where the Klan has announced that they are going to be riding through Colored Town. And Colored Town is where my main characters live. And so they've all prepared that day for that night. And this scene begins with the Klan coming into their community. I'm going to use an ugly word. I'm not going to censor the word. I'm not going to give you the first initial of the word. I'm going to say the word because my characters would have said the word and they wouldn't have been apologetic about it. So I'm not going to be apologetic. I'm only just warning you ahead of time of what's to come. "They out there, baby," she said in my ear, although I could hear the hooping and the yelling and I could see the flickering flames outside of the window. My heart quickened and I reached down beside my chair and I felt around for my purse. Once I felt it, I placed it on my lap. I couldn't imagine shooting anybody, but if it came down to it, I knew I would do what I had to do to protect me and Granny. Granny reached over and took my hand as we listened to the loud crashing sounds from out in the backyard. Then we heard Granny's chickens squawking in such a loud and frightening way. I didn't even want to think about what was happening. "Hey in there, y'all niggers come on out," a loud male voice shouted. "We about to make y'all some fried chicken. We know how much you darkies love yourselves some fried chicken." "No," Granny whimpered, "not my chickens." Granny crept over to the window. She made a painful sound, but thankfully she stayed put. "What's going on, Granny?" I whispered. She didn't answer. I crept over to the window where Granny knelt, and I was horrified by what I saw. Those bloodthirsty demons were dousing Granny's chicken coop with some type of liquid that had to be kerosene or gasoline. I wanted to run out and stop them. Those chickens were like family to Granny. Granny would sit for hours talking to those chickens and babying them. It almost broke her heart for us to use their eggs. When one of those chickens died, you would think that one of Granny's best friends had gone on to glory. She'd laugh at herself for being so silly about her baby birds, but they meant the world to her. I watched in horror as one of the men tossed a fire stick into the coop. The flames leapt into the sky and they all yelled and cheered like they were witnessing the winning run of a baseball game. The sounds those chickens made as they died in the blaze set by those Klansmen will live in my heart forever. Seemed like their screeching would never stop. I wrapped my arms around Granny. Her entire body shook with grief, but she kept quiet. I prayed they would leave, but they seemed to be getting louder. Then we heard a loud knocking at the door. I wondered where Uncle Littlebud and the men were. I wondered if they were out there watching this happen. I tried not to think about the fact that in that moment, I didn't believe anybody had the power to protect us, including God, who was painfully silent right about now. Bless your name, Jesus, Granny whispered, pulling me down to the floor so we couldn't be seen. Protect your children, Father. Let that fire in the yard burn down so low that it does no harm to this house or the others. And please, Lord, let the fire to hurt and harm burn down low in the bellies of those evil men. Come on out of there, we heard someone yell. Come on, ain't nobody gonna hurt y'all if you come on out. I knew that if they wanted to come in, it was just a matter of time before they broke through our front door. I was not planning on Granny or me being victims that night. In that moment, I felt what Cedric and the other boys in church had felt: rage, anger, a resolve not to die. If those Klansmen came into our house, they would not leave on their own steam. I had never killed another living being in my life, but I was determined that on this night, if it meant dying myself, nobody was going to hurt us without me fighting back. I reached around on the floor until I found my purse. I quickly pulled out Uncle Littlebud's pistol. Satan was not going to have his way with us. And if God really cared about colored folks, then I prayed he would give me the strength I needed to do what had to be done. When I read that story or that excerpt from my work, I recognize that I am stirring up emotions that a lot of people don't want to feel. I don't want to feel those emotions either. I tell people I wish I could write about bunny rabbits and flowers in the field and love songs. But unfortunately, life keeps keeping on in the same ways. So I'm going to end my reading by reading to you a poem that I wrote a few years ago. That's part of my poetry collection, House Repairs. I was sitting in my living room watching the news. It was July 17th, 2014. And I listened to Eric Garner say 11 times, "I can't breathe." Then in March of 2019, I listened to the news and I heard Javier Ambler say, "I can't breathe." Then on March 3rd, 2020, I listened to Manuel Ellis likewise say, "I can't breathe." And then finally, on May 25th, 2020, I listened to George Floyd 20 times say, "I can't breathe." And so I had to have some way to deal with the pain and the sadness and the anger that I was feeling in those moments. I usually preface this poem, when I read this poem, I usually preface it by saying, I don't dislike the police. But I've gotten to the point where I feel like, why do I have to explain that? Why isn't it a given that I dislike police who do bad things to people? Just like I dislike anyone who does bad things to people. And that the assumption is that, on my part, that yes, there are police officers that have done great things and are doing great things in our community. And those police officers we should embrace and we should support. But for the others, I shouldn't have to explain where I'm coming from when I share the grief and the anger and the fear. So I wrote this poem, I Must Not Breathe. If I am stopped by the cops, I must be quiet. I must not breathe. I must not ask questions. I must not breathe. I must not move. I must not breathe. I must not talk back. I must be compliant. I must not breathe. I must not film the cop. I must not call family or friends. I must not breathe. I must not put my hands up or down. I must not breathe. I must cooperate. I must be docile. I must stay in the car or get out, depending on the mood of the cop. I must not breathe too loudly or too quietly. I must only do what I am told, even if what I am told goes against my basic civil rights. I must not breathe. I must hope the cop is having a good day. I must hope the cop is a good cop. I must not hold my breath, and I must not breathe. I must not be suicidal. I must not be angry. I must be civil. I must not be disobedient. I must grin and show all of my teeth. I must shuffle and dance on cue. I must not get stopped, but if I run, I must be prepared to die. I must be prepared to die. I must be prepared to die, even on a routine stop. I must not breathe. I must not breathe. I must not breathe. Thank you.
I just had to take a moment to take that in. Um, Thank you so much for your vulnerability, because I know oftentimes, whether it's through research or books that's specifically about our communities, we're often told not to put ourselves into it. But you did the complete opposite, which, again, the theme of resistance is definitely sprinkled throughout all of our presentations. Your words and your vulnerability in and of itself, I feel, is an act of resistance. So for you, and again, just the vulnerability in having to reflect on essentially trauma, because there's just so much trauma rooted in history for Black people, people of color's history. What did you do, or what support did you have while writing these stories of these vulnerable and traumatic experiences?
Thank you. I sort of alluded to it in my discussion. Whenever I write about these difficult topics, whenever I speak my truth through poetry, I always feel the presence of those that came before me. You know, I always hear the gentle whispers of ancestral spirits saying, keep going. You're in the right. This what you're telling is our truth. And I always feel as if it weren't for that, I would have long given up on writing these very personal narratives in lieu of something lighthearted, because it isn't it's not a healthy space to be in, to be honest, all of the time. There are times I have to take mental health breaks from my own writing because it's just too much. It becomes so much that I get to the point where I have to just take a break and walk away from it and recognize that that's okay. Because if you're going to stay, it's like someone who works in sewage, like my dad used to be a plumber along with other things that he did. And you can't stay in that 24/7. You've got to come out of it and breathe some fresh air. And I think that's what I try to do for myself, is to give myself the grace and the ability to say to the ancestors, I can't do it today. You're asking too much. I'll show back up tomorrow, but today I can't handle the weight of your stories and my stories and things that are happening on the nightly news. It's just too much.
So a question we have actually from fellow author Emily Bingham. I like to tell folks who complain about the dark parts of history getting attention, are things all okay and easy right now? Okay, then why would you think things were so nice back then? Can you share your research process when doing your writing?
For almost every book I've written so far, I've spent probably a good 9 months researching it. So as I'm writing one book, I'm also researching the next book. And it's an ongoing process of, I spend a lot of time looking at newspapers. I spend a lot of time looking at old journals. I read what historians were writing or are writing about that time. I look to see what the historical figures of that time were saying and writing. It's a difficult thing to recreate some aspects of African American history, just because the archives, for various reasons, don't have a lot of material. Sometimes it's just a matter of no one felt those stories were valid enough or important enough to document. So I often have to go on this kind of like a scavenger hunt to try to recreate moments in time. And so that then forces me a lot of the time to have to put myself in that place. If you're writing about a time that's been documented properly, you can kind of stay detached. But if it's a history that is only documented in fragments, or sometimes documented through the lens of systemic racism, we can't always trust the historical details that are readily available to us. So a lot of what I do really involves putting together this elaborate puzzle where some of the pieces are missing.
So a question says, the poem you just read touched an emotional chord. Is this type of writing emotionally draining or cathartic?
Oh, thank you, Betty. It's both. It's a way of saving myself. It's why I don't write a lot of poetry. I always push back when I'm called a poet, because I feel like, I'm sorry, my Chihuahua decided now to make his presence known. I spend a lot of time just trying to figure out ways to express the emotions that I'm feeling in a way that will heal me, because it is a lot, especially when we're writing about present day events. It's one thing to write about something that took place 200 years ago, but it's another thing when the events are ongoing and they never seem to stop.
So I know you talked about, again, we just know, getting doggy under control. Oh, you're still muted, by the way.
Okay.
I get it. Sometimes our animals like to make, like you said, make their presence well known. Like, oh, I got some things to say too. They were moved.
Yeah. Here we go.
Oh, hello.
That's what happens when we do virtual events. Yep. Children, our pets, they're gonna do what they want to do, whether we want them to do it or not. So.
Oh, so sweet. So I know again, we just know that well, first of all, the theme for Women's History Month this year is celebrating women who tell our stories. And so, and like you said, much of, for Black people, people of color's history, there is not much information out there, or what was written may not truly come from the voices of the people. What recommendations would you have for folks who may be interested in going on a journey like you was able to with your writing, and maybe coming across material that kind of flips them on their head a bit?
I would say that first and foremost, make sure you're looking in unconventional places. If you're only going to the places that make the most that would make the most sense for people who have a well-documented history, you're probably not going to find much, if any, information there. If you're going to a library at a university where it was segregated up until the 1960s or 1970s, don't go there expecting to find much, if any, about people that came before that time. It's just not going to be there. So it's finding elders in your community who can share their stories and share the stories of the people that they know that came beforehand. It's also going to places like churches. I've explored a lot of church records to find snippets of information that would help me to tell a story, or I would look for, in particular, as I write about slavery now, I spent a lot of time looking at journals written by slave owners who were at least conscious of the people that they enslaved, not in terms of awareness of them being something more than Black male, 26 years old, healthy. That's what I would find in a lot of journals written by slave owners. They would take inventory of the people they owned, but you didn't find much, if anything, about who these people were. So I would look for those journals where slave owners would literally give me breadcrumbs to help me recreate a story. And those are hard to come by. And I had more dead ends than I did clear pathways. So a lot of what I do truly is the labor of channeling the ancestors, because the information is becoming lost. The longer we live, the longer information is more difficult to access of that time, because the people are dying or they're dead.
So tying again back into the theme of resistance, and I know you shared that many folks who read your writings, and like many have shared in the chat, touched an emotional chord. Well, I can assume some of those emotional chords are those who are resisting back. How have you dealt with those folks, but also what advice would you share for those who want to become these raw, authentic, and writing close to the bone resistance writers?
The thing that I have to do is to not allow those people to have an audience in my writing space. And by that, I mean, once you start publishing, you often feel the pressure to continue to be, or to become popular. And in that effort to become popular, sometimes people are willing to let go of their integrity because they want to impress readers or reviewers or even publishers. And so one thing that I always think about is something my dad said. He said, when I told him I wanted to be a writer, he said, "Be careful, little girl. Don't let the thing that you love the most be the thing that pays your light bill." And I always wonder, like, what in the world is he talking about? But what I started realizing was this, is that I never wanted the writing to be the thing that I allowed myself to pay my light bill or pay my mortgage, because then I'm more likely to not tell the truth in times when I should, because of fear of backlash, fear someone's going to ban my book, fear no one's going to invite me to speak, fear that I'm going to lose my job. So I wanted to make sure that I always had ways in which to support myself so that I could be as honest in the writing as I possibly could. So it's finding that fearlessness that dwells within us all and saying that even if I'm only speaking to an audience of one, that one being myself, my conscious, then I can be okay with that.
I know, like with your poem, you know, about I can't breathe. It seems like every single day there's a new video, there's a new story about violence, murder against many folks in multiple communities, especially for people of color, to where for some folks potentially could be desensitized and not knowing how to process this. So what advice would you share for folks trying to process this information that could be utilizing their own words to pen?
Well, I mean, the first is to recognize that Black people are processing this every day. So it's not about us. We literally are living with this fear every day. Every time my phone rings and it's my 33, almost 33-year-old son, it's the fear that something has happened. It's never, oh, maybe he's just calling to check in with mom and see how I'm doing. It's something has happened and I've got to go in protect mode. So it's recognizing that even though you might be able to walk past the television and think to yourself, oh, well, another event, and keep it going. Those of us who live the trauma every day, whether it's you live the trauma of brutality by certain police officers, whether it's you've lived the trauma of school shootings, whether it's you've lived the trauma of addiction in your family, those news stories are more than news stories to those of us who are experiencing it firsthand. So it's calling on that empathy, you know, that's necessary. I think back to the conversation that we just had about my old Kentucky home. And I always wonder, why are we even debating things like that? If enough people are telling me that something is hurting them or making them feel bad about themselves, why is it a debate as to whether or not we should keep doing something? Before I would hurt anybody in this call, all I see are the initials of your names. But if any one of you reached out to me and said, when you do this, it hurts me. And then several more of you say, when you do that, it hurts me too. Then I'm going to start addressing how I conduct myself. I don't want to cause anyone any kind of pain. Now, pointing out history is going to cause a different kind of pain. But doing things that willfully and intentionally cause pain that we could just stop doing, I've never understood why that's a debate.
Final question, which I know you've touched a bit on this, but anything else you'd like to share, advice to aspiring writers and of course resistors?
Don't give up. That's it. Don't give up. You're going to get tired. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to get overwhelmed, but don't give up. And Walter says the same.
Yes, Walter, we agree as well. So, Angela, thank you so much for, again, your vulnerability, but like you said, being unapologetic about that, as you should and as we all should be. So everyone, please join me in thanking her today for an amazing presentation and, of course, writings. So before we close out, go ahead and go back to the presentation for final notes. So again, if you are wanting to read yourself from Angela's books, again, these are available at Carmichael's Bookstore, Louisville's oldest independent bookstore. So definitely make sure you check those out. And we will have links in the chat. And then it is Women's History Month. And so please check out our Women's History Month calendar. I also have a link in the chat and an email that will be sent to you guys on Monday. We'll have this as well, but there's a lot of stuff happening, including the Women's Center is celebrating 30 years this year. Our future is intersectional, reimagining leadership development. And we invite you to attend this as well. It's open to the community. It's going to be a huge celebration, and we want everyone to be in attendance. And so link is also in the chat for that. And again, please complete our evaluation, which the link is also in the chat. And so for those of you that are comfortable, I will enable everyone's camera, since we are not together in person right now, to take a group photo. So if you just give me one moment and I will get that going. Teams changed some things on me. Okay, you should now be able to turn on your cameras. Since we know we're obviously not in a room, I'm going to put us in a room. So giving folks a few moments to turn cameras on. I want to be in the picture. Okay, 1 more minute. Got some more cameras coming on. All righty. They've added some new features. Okay. All right. I'm gonna do 2 because I always know people's eyes closed during certain moments. So I'll count to 3, and then we'll take the photo. All right. 1, 2, 3. And then again, 1, 2, 3. Thank you guys so much. And again, for those of you who will be watching later on that have been impacted by the severe weather, and those that are on right now, we're sending you positive energy. I still don't have power, so I feel the pain. But stay safe, and we look forward to having you in person next year. So thank you guys, and happy Women's History Month.